Let me put all of this together using a couple of examples. Let's start with Dr. Smith. What is the jury going to have to say? Well, first of all, they might have to ask, in a sense, what kind of case are we dealing with? Now, chances are, in our system, that's going to be already spelled out. There's been enough medical malpractice cases that they'll probably say, okay, we're dealing with a medical malpractice case. Right? Now, once we figured out what type of case we're dealing with, the law is going to give us an answer, which is probably going to be a negligence standard, right? Especially if the doctor's done what doctors are supposed to do and gone through informed consent, etc. Right? Well, we've got a negligence standard. All right, so we determined what our standard is. Now we have to look at the facts of the case and see what happened. Was the doctor in fact negligent? And if it turns out that the doctor was in fact negligent, well, then he's going to have to pay. If it turns out the doctor had done everything he should have done and more to prevent this from happening, then the jury's going to say, no, we have a negligence standard. There was no negligence. He was causally responsible but not negligent. And so, Dr. Smith does not have to pay. Now let's look at a slightly different case. Let's look at a workers' compensation case in Illinois. The jury is going to start by saying, what type of case are we dealing with? Well, it's clearly involving employment. Okay, so we've determined by the rules that are set down, we have to treat this as a workers' compensation case. In workers' compensation case, what standard applies? Strict liability. What causal relationship was there? Well, all we have to ask was he on the job? Right? He was on the job. That's the right kind of causal relationship in this situation. Strict liability applies. The employer has to pay. Now, of course, in Illinois, he's also required to have workers' compensation insurance. So that adds some wrinkles to it. But now let's look at a third case. Think of my example where the person gets hurt during a soccer game. At that point, we could imagine that the jury looks at it and says, oh, wow, we don't have a very definite settled thing in the statutes or in the case law that tells us what kind of case we're dealing with. This is an unusual case. They might have to sort of go back to the principles and say, okay, well, what are the sort of standards we seem to use for determining which kind of standards applies in which kind of case? Once we've got it sorted out, we figure out the standard that applies, we look at the facts, and we figure out whether the defendant will have to pay. Right. So that puts all our questions together, right? We have to figure out what kind of case we're dealing with, right? And sometimes that will go back to going to the reasons why certain sorts of cases require certain sorts of standards. We figure out which standard we're dealing with, which is spelled out either explicitly by the statutes or by some sort of principles. Once we've got the standard, we look at the facts of the case to determine what kind of causal relationship was there, and we get our answer to the question of whether or not the defendant was liable.